Welcome to today's podcast episode. I am so excited to be able to introduce to you this guest. Um, Before I introduce her, I will say why I thought of having her is because probably one of the most common conversations I have with people and the questions they ask in coaching sessions or even just in friendships and people that I meet is the older we get, the more we're trying to have growth mindset, the we're trying to understand who we are, we're trying to evolve as people. But so much of that understanding us is going back into the past. And what I most often ask people first is how curious are they about the other people in their lives? Because I'm sure you can imagine when you talk about your childhood, it's really easy to just only share from your perspective. And this is how I was traumatized. This is the pain and woes that I went through. These are the good memories. These are the bad memories. But it's only one sided. And I think, we can't always go back and repair things that have happened. It is what it is. It's done for. But a lot of healing can come in when we can view the people from our past as just human beings. They have the same emotions that you do. They go through the same angst and woes. Like however old you are right now, your mom, your dad, your siblings, like they were once that age too and went through the same woes that you've gone through. And so today I have my mom with us. And so I want to just show you guys just maybe some questions if you've never thought about asking your mom before, or a family member in the past, or somebody that you grew up with that was pivotal in your upbringing. How much do you even know about them as a person? What did they go through? And being able to use that as a tool to really build new connections now. Get to know each other as equals, as friends, as people who really see and know each other. So I want to take you guys on a journey today with my mom. We're going to talk about some lighthearted stuff, some high level things, some questions. Like I want you to be thinking as you're listening to this, like, wait, do I know the answer for my mom or my dad? And what would I want to know from them that I've really never even considered from their perspective? So let's get curious. This is my mom. Her name is Wendy. I guess I should give her her real name, Wendy Cheryl. And so, Mom, how about just to start us off, can you give us just like maybe a high level snippet timeline of you today?
Hi everybody. I am Wendy and Kylie's mom. Excited to be here. Kylie's doing such a great job with her podcast, and just wanted to help her. And this is a great subject. It's a great conversation.
Yeah.
So, overview of me: I was born in Ashland, Ohio, and moved within a month of being born to Detroit, Michigan, where my dad was an airline mechanic, and ultimately ended up working for a church there. And we bought my mom and dad bought their first house when I was about 5, and we moved into this brand new, come to find out it was like 600 square feet ranch, but I thought it was huge. And I was so excited about that, loved it, got my first puppy, just all excited. And then my parents decided to move to Australia,
Mm,
do mission work. And so we packed up and moved to Sydney, Australia. We lived in Australia doing mission work for 5 years, and I thought that was my home. I loved it. I was young. I was about 9 when
okay.
we moved there. I was about 14 when we came home to America. Um, I have one brother. So, me and my brother and my mom and my dad, the four of us, went to Australia. We came home to America because my mom's brother was dying from cancer, and his wife had died 6 years earlier, and their three children were going to need a home.
Mm,
And so we actually moved back to America to take on these three um, soon to be orphan children.
yeah.
And we had not, I had only met them maybe once or twice in my life. We didn't know them. We'd been gone a lot. My parents, so it's a huge transition, like moving from what I thought was home in Australia to an American culture was a big change in and of itself. But then to add three children
Yeah.
into the beautiful, peaceful, everything my way world was shocking, to say the least.
Mm.
And went to middle school there in Michigan. We moved back into that same house in Michigan. We
Oh, wow.
refurbished the basement to make room for the kids. And yeah, that was a tumultuous teen years. Like, just, I can't even share. Someday we'll have a story about just my life during that time. But
Yeah.
I boogied a lot on my horse because my dad, in his wisdom, knew my love for animals and got me a horse.
Mhm.
So me and my horse got through it. And
Yeah.
so then I met my husband, Kylie's dad, in high school. Well, we met in junior high,
Okay.
but then we actually started dating in high school and got married at 18 out of high school.
Ooh.
And we didn't decide not to have children, but we didn't decide to have them, and we didn't decide not to have them.
Okay.
So I got
You were
pregnant
too young to
about
know
6
to
months.
go with them?
We were just having a
Like,
good time. We were growing up together, having a
yeah.
great time. So he was at university. We lived in married housing, and our son Colin was born about a year and a half later.
Okay.
And
After you got married, right? Sorry, I might have paused you when you were telling that.
oh, sorry,
Did you get pregnant on the honeymoon? Like,
we got married. This is how we tell. This is how Dad tells it. I'll tell you because you'll get a kick out of it. But um, we got married in July. Well, we graduated from high school in May.
okay.
Got married in July. We got pregnant in November. Um, and we were broke by December. That's what that is.
That sounds familiar.
So that was our first year of marriage. And then we got through college. My husband finished his schooling, got his degree, took our first job, and moved to Pennsylvania. We moved to Philadelphia. And we had already moved out of married housing into an apartment. So that was another move, temporary housing apartment, and then to Philadelphia. My story is filled with moves. And for those of you who don't know me, I don't like to move. I have a lot of issues with moving, but I've moved my entire life.
Yeah.
So we moved to Philadelphia, and then we later moved us to, and let's see, Kylie would have been 2, Colin would have been 5. And we moved to Seattle, Washington when Kylie was 7 and Colin was 10. And then we moved back to Michigan in your middle school years, Kylie. And then I started co parenting with a single mom and her 2 children. And that um, Romika was about 2, and LJ, her brother, was 4. And bit by bit by bit over the years, kind of co parenting. I did real estate for a little bit during that time, helped my dad, and just kind of lived life. We did a lot of ministry work over the years, volunteering. Ultimately, my husband decided to go into full time ministry. We then took a small church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then we moved to Omaha, Nebraska. And now we have just moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Yeah.
So a life full of moving, a life full of changes, a life full of um, good good relationships, loss of relationships, but that's basically a nutshell me.
Yeah. I
Oh, and I
love
became a disciple when I was 14 in Australia. I was baptized.
there you go.
I've been in love with the Lord my whole life. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, I love how it's interesting, even just hearing that timeline of how much you really have moved. And I think for those of you that have listened to this podcast, you've heard me share about all of my moves. Like, I also have moved a ton my whole life. I continued it on in my own marriage,
yeah,
which was shocking. Not really anything that clearly, as a kid in the house, I didn't really have much say over it. And
right,
now married, like, I have a say in it, but it doesn't necessarily happen intentionally. Um, but I loved moving. Like, that wasn't necessarily a part of my trauma, but I have different trauma from it, right? Like, it has, and maybe we could use, these are little t traumas we're talking about, people.
right.
Maybe deep wounds, but it does mold
Mhm.
our character, right? It does have an impact, and it does really become a part of who we are and sets us on a different path. And so
Right.
those
Right.
paths that we do take, it has an impact on us.
Yes.
And so I think thank you for sharing just the whole high level. Like that's a lot of information that even as a kid, okay, I wouldn't have really comprehended the story about my aunt and uncles
Right.
because I wouldn't have known that when I was 5. I have no business knowing that. And I'm sure at some point you guys just stopped having to put disclaimers on it, right? Like you just are siblings. You went from cousins to
Right.
siblings.
Right.
You were still,
Now I do say I have 5 there's 5 children in my family, and
yeah,
that's call them brother and sister, so most people probably don't pick up on that.
yeah. And it's been so long. Like there's, it just adds confusion when you start having to clarify and quantify things.
Right.
But I think there's stories there, right? So I think even just hearing and listening and your high level view, there's lots of little snippets to be like, oh, like what was that like? Right. And I think, especially now that I'm in my 40s, so I have a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old. And so, even me having a teenager, right? So, in my own personal development, I'm now considering like, I now have the hindsight 2020 to be like, oh, what was I like as a teenager? And now as a mom, I'm like, what was my mom going through when I was a teenager? And I think that's the safest space. Like when you're not going back into your past because there's accusations and there's offenses and we need vengeance or we need to right some kind of a wrong. Those things might still need to happen, but one of the safest places you can go is to just get curious and put the humanity on the people in our lives. Right. And I feel like I was so lucky, and I really appreciate about you that we were able to have accidentally, right? Like I didn't intentionally know that this is what was happening. I don't think either of us intended for this big conversation to happen. And even as me and you were talking about it a few weeks ago, you're like, it wasn't even as pivotal to you as it was to me. I don't think 'cause it was like life changing for me. But when I went from 19 to 20, maybe, I at least was out of, I had an associate's degree. I was buying my first home, but I was still really young, but I was working full time at Progressive Auto Insurance, so I could afford it. Like I really wanted to go be a grown up. And I was just wrestling with trying to prove my individuality and wanted to make sure like I was doing what I wanted to do and not just, being convinced one way or the other, but still wanted the support, but just didn't know how to be a grown up, how to be an independent person while still having family and having parents that want to give advice. And I want to be open to advice, right? So, sorry, a long story short. So, my mom and I had this huge blowout conversation that was just this like the ripping off of parent child relationship to more of a friendship and a mentoring, right? Like a healthy, loving adult relationship with your mother. And I think it was even just in that moment to be able to, a lot of the conversation that I remember was us just being, even just for me to hear, like, here's what I thought my childhood was doing, was happening, right? Here's what I thought you were doing. Here's what I heard you say. Here's what I heard you intend. And it took a willingness, I think, on both of our parts to be able to just acknowledge that, oh, that was each other's experience.
Mhm.
And then to be able to say, well, this is where I was coming from. And then we had a choice to just accept it or not. Right. Like I felt like I was willing to say, okay, this is what you meant. Then that's going to become my new story.
Right.
That's how I'm going to experience it. Like there's some forgiveness in that. There's some letting go of the
Mhm.
hurts, the wounds, the interpretations, right? But you also still allowed me to have that kind of have my feelings be heard and understand. Like we were both just willing to be curious
Right.
about each other's experience. So, what do you remember of that conversation or your takeaway, or even me reliving it now? Like, what are you thinking?
Sure. Well, it's so funny because, for those of you who don't have context, I worked in real estate for about 6 years, and Kylie decided that she was going to buy her first home and did not use me as her realtor. And
But I did
I
use Colin, my brother. He was also doing real
oh
estate.
yeah, that's thank you, Kylie.
You're
I
welcome.
forgot. Just trying to as
No complaints.
I remember it wasn't me, so that's it's my memory. It just wasn't me. It didn't matter who it was. Um, but I, for whatever reason, I think for me, the story in my head that I developed as a child, which if we went back into my childhood, I have a mom who is a perfectionist and loves control. And it's a loving protection, like she wants to protect me from anything bad that's happening. But my takeaway was I'm not smart enough to make decisions on my own
Mm,
because I need her to make these decisions for me because she knows better.
mm,
And so as I grew up and developed my own world, and I think it was good that I moved away far, so I kind of got to think on my own. But when I started this real estate career, I was so shocked that I could actually do that. And so Kylie not choosing me, while we didn't realize it at the time, triggered a lot of wounds in me. I think that she didn't think I was good enough to help her.
mm.
She didn't want my help. She didn't trust my help. And so that was where my story went to, which wasn't at all what Kylie was thinking.
Yeah.
And when we had that conversation, I think that came out just the humanness of what I was feeling and my own rejection. I wasn't really looking at it from your perspective. I was very focused on my perspective and how I was being hurt. And
Yeah.
so we came home from somewhere, and Kylie just announced that she'd bought a house. I
Hmm.
hadn't seen it. I hadn't looked at it. Dad hadn't done any of the finances on it. We hadn't done a budget. Like all the things that we trained her to do that was our role in her life.
Yeah.
She just like went way out there, and it's a permanent thing to buy a
Yes.
house.
Big deal.
It's a decision that you can't go back from. And so it was important, I think, for us to realize number one, that you were grown enough to be independent, and we weren't seeing that yet. And you needed to
Yeah.
stretch your wings and you needed to be independent. And we needed to let go and allow you that space to do that. And it wasn't about me.
Yeah.
And I think that was a pivotal moment for both of us to
Yeah.
just realize that we are both coming at this from a place of love and care and protection for one another, just being aware of how we're affecting one another.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was my memory of it.
Yeah. Which is interesting even now, because I'm like, my memory of that conversation had nothing to do with the house. But and I appreciate even here, like this is, even if I did remember that was part of the conversation, I think here's also a side benefit to having these conversations again, is that we are both in a different place to be able to say it again and to hear each other differently. Right.
Yeah.
Because the way I can hear you right now and how much autonomy I've had and how much maturity we've both experienced, like even just the way we communicated is different, and the way we hear each other and can empathize with each other is very different. And
Absolutely.
so I appreciate hearing that again, right? Like that was some new information that I got about that time for you, because I don't know that I was too into my feelings to even hear that sentence. And I don't know that you were able to verbally clearly state that wound that you were feeling between you and your mom. But
Yeah.
what I did hear in that moment, right? Because what I do remember for me was that I was so trying to prove that I could do it by myself.
Yes.
Right. So it's
Absolutely.
almost like it was similar, but a different angle
Well,
than
what's interesting is
yours.
I didn't learn about my wound of not being smart enough until I was in my 50s.
Mm,
So I think even back then when we had that conversation, I was triggered. I
yeah.
was hurt, but I didn't really understand why that hurt me.
Yeah.
And so that would have been really hard for me to convey, I think,
Yeah.
because I wasn't aware. And I think that's the beauty of our age. As we grow and we get older, we know ourselves better. We learn about things, about our character. We can look back and we can say, hey, that's why I did that, or that's why I
Yeah.
responded that way. And it's really amazing adventure of life to just kind of figure out. And that's why I love this episode, because it is important to go back and see even how to rethink how I reacted and how that affected you or
Yeah.
how it affected people in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in that conversation, I think what I do really feel like was a blessing. I don't think I knew it in the moment, but the more I have these kind of conversations with people, to realize like we didn't know how great we were going to have it, that we have that kind of a blowout conversation. Even in the little bit of information that we had, all we knew was we were both triggered and we were like committed to have a triggered conversation that we created in that space, like a commitment that we wanted to, we were still going to be family. This was not going to be a deal breaker, but clearly this is something, a shift is happening. And
Ex-
we now need to create something new, right? Because even in all of those, even if that was, it wasn't the only issue at hand, right? Because I'm still young. There's still, like, we would have had to go through all of those things, even if you didn't have that one wound,
Right.
right? Like, there's a lot of circumstances, there's logistics about it. Just even having to figure out, like, we had to learn how to be like, how we were going to spend time together because I was no longer going to be under your roof. So what we had to redefine the relationship. And I think we didn't know that that's what we were doing in that moment.
Had to redefine it at every turn. Like I think if your audience just can rest and
Hmm.
be aware that long-term relationships, family life relationships, they have to evolve and change
Yeah.
and grow because we're all moving into all different stages of life. And even my mom now at 86, I'm more her care, not a caregiver because she's totally healthy, but I think emotional support.
Yeah.
It shifted at some point, and so there's these shifts. Even when you had children and moved away and you were parenting, I had to shift. And
Yes.
now you have teenagers, I have to shift. And
Yeah.
it's a life walk. And I think the more we embrace the continuity of we're going to love each other, we're going to be family, this is not changing, that safety, we can shift a lot easier.
Yeah. 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 I love that. And that's a great point because really at every stage, and I think that's the point where we're talking about when we're trying to heal ourselves,
Mhm.
if we're willing to also, because it's clearer to me when I'm transitioning, right? Like I'm going from teenagehood, I'm graduating high school to college to marriage to changing jobs to becoming a parent, right?
What
Like
is stopping you from doing all that? Don't go to high school. Don't go to middle. Don't go to college. Get married. Don't have children. Stay little. Stay little.
yeah. But at the same time, like I know it's happening to me,
Mhm.
but there's so much that we are unwilling to realize that it's also happening to you,
Right.
right? And at the same time, as I'm going from teenagehood to college, you also then are going from empty nesting, right? Like you're going from a parent to an empty nester, or when you went from toddler stage to teenagers, like you were going through your own transition. And I think the more that we can just, it's that curiosity and the humanity that if we can see both sides of the story, and it doesn't have to be like an invalidating of our wounds, but it is a willingness to consider, be curious, like you're going through something, but so is the
Right.
other person. And it's
Right.
different. Like it might be being triggered by whatever you're going through, but what we're going through is very different. It doesn't have to be the same.
Yeah. That's good.
So I think one thing that's important to highlight in this conversation that we're having, for those of you that have never had this kind of conversation with your family before, is that if it's never been done and you guys have never like done this, then you also are asking something very new and different of your relationship.
Mm.
And so there might need to be some baby steps being taken. It might need to start on just the surfacey things that really are not deep and emotional. Like, even if you can hear like my mom's story, like she was vulnerable in her sharing, even though she wasn't sharing deep parts. She insinuated, she let us know that there were some triggering moments, there were hardships, there was some emotion in there. that if she's ready, I could then go in and ask her more questions. So I'm super grateful, one, that my mom is ready. Like, I feel like that's the standard that has been set. And I feel like because of that big, huge conversation that we had when I bought the house, like it kind of just blew the roof off of that and opened the door. But even thinking about it, and I want to get your thoughts on, your mom and your grandma and our generations in the past. I do feel like what set us up for success to have that conversation is that we did intentionally know that we were going to break a generational dysfunction. And we were both committed to creating something new. And so I think that that is probably the first step for people to first get buy-in. Like, is the people you want to get to know, are they also committed to getting to know each other?
Mhm.
And then keep going as deep as you can throughout the years.
Mhm.
So maybe share with us. I know that we've done a lot of work, and Grams, I call her Grams, that's my mom's mom, has been a great participant in that conversation with me. And I have a different kind of in than even you do, mom, with
Right.
having a conversation with your mom, right? Like, we all carry something a little bit different. We're triggered in different ways. We're
Yeah.
able to go deeper in different ways. But maybe, like, do you think Mimi, so that would have been your grandma, your mom's mom, would have even been able to have that conversation? Was she willing to share vulnerably? Like, how much do you feel like did you kind of do that in your past generations?
That's a great question. Mimi, my grandmother, she didn't, she had a lot of family secrets, a lot of, I think, a lot of things that the children were not to talk about. She didn't talk about to them. And it was interesting because actually at her funeral, my mom and her two brothers sat down and talked about things that they had never talked about and
Mm,
would have never spoken about while my grandmother was living,
wow.
because it was just not acceptable to do.
Mm,
And so they were learning things about each other at this dinner after the funeral, and I had the gift of being there to hear it, and I was like, "Whoa, what is happening here?" Because my mom was getting answers to wounds that she had as a child, because
mm,
they were much older than her.
mm.
So they were experiencing something totally different. And I mean, huge things, like they were put in an orphanage for a while.
Yeah.
Like these aren't little things. And my mom just knew they were gone. It's
Yes.
strange, like all kinds of just traumatic things, even that my mom had growing up in my grandmother's younger years were different than as my grandmother got older and more spiritual in her walk with God. And so, no, I don't think those conversations, they were not open to have. Sometimes I would trepidatiously ask her a question here or there, and
Mm,
she would brush it off and go make lunch, like
mm,
it just wasn't, she wasn't open. Now, my mom was not open until my grandmother passed away. And then she sort of felt a freedom and as she got older. And so, very, very, very slowly, we have gotten to a place where now at age 86, she is open. And now, as she's starting to think about passing away and us not knowing our history or our heritage, she's much more invested in wanting us to know, wanting us to have that legacy, wanting us to have um, the best that we can have with our futures. And so I love that about just as our relationship has grown, really being able to work on things that were always taboo in the
yeah.
past. And so
Yeah.
that's been really refreshing. And I think that's even opened me up as I've explored my own life. And I think that's one thing, Kylie, that I think I just want to let people know too is, you know, the moms, we have to have our own personal journey and our own awareness and our own desire to really explore who we are.
Mm,
so that we can be helpful to the next generation.
Mm.
Because I think the moms that are maybe afraid to go into those places says, "I'm always afraid of everything," it's kind of my go-to. But, trepidatiously going into unexplored territory.
Yeah.
But as I've done that, I've been more aware of who I am, therefore, I am more able to share who I am with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Because I think even, and that's probably what I feel like, because we intentionally chose to build differently, even though we didn't really know what that was. Like, because I remember when we moved when I was 13 back to Michigan, close to family.
Mhm.
I didn't grow up near family. Like, we just would visit once or twice a year, I feel like is my experience of, the generations. But then moving back and being close and just observing, like we would go to lunch with you and my grandma and my great grandma.
Mhm.
And just seeing like me as a kid, just being able to see, like, just, I don't know what I was observing, but I knew I wanted something different, right? Like, so,
Like, this is stressful.
like, even just to improve, like, it's not like it was bad or traumatic, but I was like, and it was actually probably more selfish on my part of just hearing, like, just the way that we can function sometimes as family, where we are trying to not be causing conflict. We're just trying to please. We're trying to tread lightly and not rock the boat. Like, what
Yes.
I observed was just this, like, really cranky great grandma who was impleasable, and Gram's working her tail off to please her. And we're just along for the ride. And I was like, I am not going to be Gram's to you someday. Right.
Right.
That is, but I don't want that. So let's purposefully, which I feel like, we didn't have to, it did, I don't know that it did anything to us in my teen years, but I think it did. We did know then that somehow what were we going to create? And it had to just be something different. But I think it was based on a foundation of like improving what was. It's not like we had to throw it away and the foundation was terrible, but how do we repair? And so I would have been in my 20s when Mimi passed. And so even just thinking through then our timelines, right? So I was 20. Were you 43 when Mimi passed?
Yeah, I've been 43.
Oh, that's kind of crazy to think about. And so only then, when you were 43, did you get to start experiencing that openness with your mom
Right.
to her whole future. And then you could then stand in the place where I got to be I got to be there 20 years faster than you did.
Yes,
Like
right.
being with a mom who was willing to embrace her past and share vulnerably and just be
Yeah.
open to getting to know each other, which
Well,
is,
and I noticed that you and Lily even have so much more conversation about emotions and feelings and what you're
yeah,
thinking and feeling. I am just thrilled with that next generation being even 10 years earlier,
yeah,
having those conversations and being able to be vulnerable and open,
yeah, it's
which,
true.
it's just generationally improving each generation because of each person's braveness
Yeah,
and being able to have these kinds of conversations.
yeah. Okay, that makes me think of a question. Because I think my immediate answer to that is I think, yes, I totally agree. And I'm super grateful that I'm like, because she has shared stuff with me that I would have never been
Right.
comfortable sharing with you. You weren't asking, and I certainly wouldn't have told you. So again, when it's a perceived, like, I assumed that it would be a problem, or I assumed shame, or I assumed judgment, and I never even gave you a chance, and you weren't necessarily trying to pull it out of me. But from where I'm standing, it's a very scary road because I feel very unprepared to have all of her feelings.
I can only
And so
imagine.
it's making me think, like, I wonder how uncomfortable can you relate to any of that then when I was 20 and you're 40 and we kind of, if we were like doing what like me and Lily can do now, where it still was something new, how
Yeah.
scary has that been for you to
Mm.
kind of ride this ride that we've been creating? I guess, I don't know, maybe you have been just as unprepared to handle my expressions than I feel to be prepared to handle Lily's, right?
Well, I don't know. I kind of live in this one of my spiritual gifts is mercy.
Praise the Lord.
Strongest gift is mercy.
It's not mine.
And so it's a little difficult as I was trying to give you that mercy. But so I think for me, I had a lot of positive assumptions about our relationship, and I naively just thought we were so close, like you would just tell me everything. If there was anything to share, you would share it because we're so close. And we're just so different than everybody, all these other mother and daughters that are having all this conflict. And, I just felt like every I didn't explore your deeper emotions. I just assumed that if you didn't say anything, then you were good,
Yeah.
And so when we talked, everything was good. And
Yeah.
I didn't dig into wanting to disrupt that.
Mm,
And I have found, like, in my life, in relationships, I really do want them to be peaceful.
yeah.
I want them to be mutually joyful and content. And so I kind of create that in my mind. And so I don't always go into to places that I think might be
Mm,
trepidatious or harmful or hurtful. Uh, so I think that kind of probably prevented us from having some of the conversations where I would, because I remember, like, even some of the things that you went through in your teen years, I would ask you a question, you would give me just enough information that I would be like, oh, okay, well, here's some things we can do for that. And now we're good. And this is great. But years later, finding out that, you were just tipping your toes in the water of what you really probably needed and wanted to share.
mm,
And you were just testing to see how much I could handle.
mm.
At least that's my thought on it and
Yeah.
how I felt. Looking back on it, I was like, wow, you were just kind of throwing out a line to see what I did with it and how I responded. And if I was content with that answer and moved on,
Yeah.
you didn't feel any need to disrupt that boat by
Yeah.
giving me a fuller dose of what
Yeah.
was really happening.
Yeah.
I think we were constantly in an environment of protecting,
Yeah.
really wanting, you knew how much I needed peace. And I think I wasn't willing to disrupt the peace to really dig into your heart, to
Mm,
really figure out what you were really going through and really thinking and feeling. I was content with the tip of the iceberg
yeah. Yeah.
and content to believe that everything was really in a safe, healthy, peaceful place. And I don't think that was good for you. I feel like that was something that I think you've discovered for the next generation, that you need to ask the tough questions and
Mm,
you want to know what's underneath the feeling. And when you hear a word, you explore that word. And so I think that's an improvement in that next generation.
yeah. Well, and I think it's even reliving that now because I'm like, my memories, I don't feel scarred in my teen years. Like I don't even bring that into little T trauma necessarily in those moments because and so what it's making me think, so even as you guys are listening to this, to have some hope that it is a marathon. It's a relationship to continue to mature through because I think that I don't think I even knew what I needed or wanted in my teen years,
Yeah.
right? But now that because we sort of maybe tested the waters a little bit or as because we were both kind of in this, we were maturing side by side. You were doing your best when I was a teenager, which you would have been in your 30s then,
I was
right?
young.
So
Mhm.
you were still really young. I'm in my teen years. And then as we got older, because I think that, and that was the cost that I'll say now of us moving all the time. I think I was not aware of my emotions in my
Right.
teen years. I was spending all my time just cutting them off and it didn't matter. And I could move callously. Whereas I feel like in your journey, everywhere you moved, you were planting seeds and watching them grow as if this was your last, like all in every step of the way.
Evilly believing that
Yes,
this relationship will be forever.
this is it. And so I moved in feeling like I'm here for the moment. I'm counting down the days till I leave.
Mm.
And so only until we moved here to Texas for whatever reason, whether it was I don't know, just the stage of life we were in, whatever it was. This is the very first time I've ever lived someplace 2 feet in, fully commit, like fully present to like, I'm here for as long as I'm here. Mind, body, spirit, all of it. And so as a teen, like I don't even know that I knew that then, but then as we got into our 20s, and then there's even more of that hindsight that I think as we each mature and we start realizing and experiencing it firsthand, right? Like until you can walk in somebody else's shoes, you just don't understand. And I think that's really the hope to offer is that now that you are where you are and you're willing to consider, like, okay, what was happening in those other people's lives at that age?
Right.
Else was going on? Not everything is about you. What else was going on? So that's interesting to think about, even that timing for Grammys. So your mom, my grandma, to have started to really open the door to vulnerability in her past and sharing vulnerably. Is she 20 years older than you? So she would have been in her 60s. She was your age, like a little bit younger than you.
And then it was a slow process. It was really only after my dad passed away and she was kind of forced to be an individual as opposed to a couple that I think she even started exploring her own place. So like I was saying, like when we're ready to explore ourselves,
Yeah.
then we're ready to give. And I think she was actually, after my dad passed away, she would have been almost 70,
Mm.
69,
Yeah.
before she really felt free to focus on herself and her own self-improvement
Yeah.
and spill that over onto me, which
Yeah.
I was ready for because I had been exploring my I had started even earlier exploring myself and had a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And there's still probably lots of things that I would love to know that maybe I'm actually finding out things from conversations you and Romika are able to have with my mom
Yeah.
that she really wouldn't feel safe having with me because it would trigger disrespect, it would trigger fear, it would just losing control. Like there's just things that go into the relationship that her and I have to feel safe and for me to allow her to feel safe because I have my own triggers.
Yes.
So between the two of us, we have to be a lot more cautious, I think, in our conversations with one another, where the grandkids have this freedom of unaccepted unabashed love.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she just thinks everything's wonderful to talk with you guys. I love that
Yeah.
because it's a that window.
Yeah. And maybe that's part of the grand plan, right? Of the intergenerations, that we get to kind of be those young wild people and just ask the outlandish things that has no ulterior motive. There's no like a personal attachment. Because I remember when you were talking about the information that she found out at Mimi's funeral, like the last visit I think I had with her, I just could not believe the things she was telling me that went happen, like with the orphanage and all the things. And I was like, what on earth? Like, this is some serious tea here.
And explain who they are as people. And we don't even give them grace for that our whole life because we don't even know.
Yeah, we're just so
Been a lot nicer if I'd known you went through all that.
well. And I always think of like, that is one of the things that I do tell my daughter is I'm like, I always point out in movies, in those scenarios when like the entire premise is about the main character suffering in silence through the whole thing, avoiding being known, of like just trying to,
Everybody.
yeah, like I can fix it all by myself. I don't need anybody. Let me not be a burden on those people. And when we go through life trying to not burden other people with our feelings, like it causes like unintended damage. It causes unintended disconnect. Like we miss out on so much community and support and love that we could have had we just been willing to have the conversation. And instead, we're feeling so threatened or protective. And something that I hear that I'm curious about that might be generational and it might still happen now that we could just be cautious about is the confusion between loyalty and honesty. right?
Yeah.
Because I hear a lot of even like just we're trying to protect our own feelings, we're trying to protect like the reputation of other people. And so even just like there's got to be ways around being honest and sharing your own personal experiences versus you're telling other people's. It's not always gossip and slander
That's
when
right.
you're sharing your own life. And there's important things. Like I think it probably is valuable that when I was 5, I'm super grateful you were not telling me all of your drama in your marriage, right? Like I don't need to know all of your pain and woes then, but it could be a little bit more helpful now, right? Like, so even in some of those situations, it's
That's
interesting.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that it really is so true because I think we do spend so much time protecting each other. And I feel like it has a lot to do with our security in Christ because as we realize that God is in control and He is a part of our story and He's protecting our story and He wants to use our story to
Mhm.
help others, we become freer to then allow his protection to cover what we're sharing.
Yeah.
And I think the more I was really taught this, we were part of a certain fellowship of churches, and then we moved into one that was much more open and much more conversational, much more discipling. And I remember the first time like sharing something that I would consider to be taboo to share about my marriage
Mm.
with a close friend who asked a good question, and I gave her an honest answer. And she survived, and she loved me, and she was like, "Wow, that's really cool." And, after I shared my story, she looked at me and she says, "You know, Wendy, it's just really good when, we learn to take responsibility for our own decisions."
Mm.
And it was life-changing for me because my story was always the victim of I could do more if this person wasn't the way they were. You
Mm.
know, um, I'm being and doing what I'm doing because this other person needs me to do this or needs me to be who I am. And
Yeah.
not really seeing that I was also a participant and made my own choices and could make my own choices. And then that really opened a door for me to start exploring, is it safe to be able to share something vulnerable and people still love me?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, it was.
Yeah.
And they actually loved me more
Yeah.
because I was more relatable and I was more like them.
Yeah.
And so that has opened doors. And I was probably mid 40, right around your age, I think.
Mm.
And so that opened up a door for me to really be who I am today, much
Yeah.
more willing to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
open to
Yeah.
being flawed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Once we get in touch with our humanness and our ability to be flawed, and God still loves us and people still love us,
Yeah.
it can be really helpful and useful.
Yeah. Well, and
Mm.
I think too, what's important to remember about that, and I'm glad you brought that up, is because we can still experience this kind of freedom and healing and have grace and compassion and forgiveness for others where it needs to be when they are not available to be vulnerable, right? So even whether somebody in your past has passed away and you can't have these conversations, or they're still unwilling or unable, right? For whatever reason that you cannot cross this bridge with them to having this like fully seen and heard, open, vulnerable relationship, you can still find the freedom with or without them. And it is in our own security. And I would say the more somebody is shut down and unable to share vulnerably, the more it says about them and what they can or cannot do. Like the fear and shame and restrictions like that they're experiencing, as opposed to you're not worth it if you were better, right? Like that, like the more shut down someone is, the more we can lean into just separate. Like, then I can't make that mean anything about me.
Right.
Let me just be gentle around them. Like, what did they need me to be? I can just love them without knowing them, right? Like, I can still just show up and serve whatever we need to do. We can still, and that just is what it is, then. That's as deep as that relationship can go. And so, how do we go find other people to have a relationship with?
Yeah, exactly. And I think being able to accept them where they're at is so much freedom in that. And
Yeah.
to remember that their story is their story and it doesn't have to be your story.
Yeah.
I think with as we've become more gracious and giving to one another, those doors can slowly open.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we just barrel in with our anger or our hurt or our
Mhm.
shame, and we don't consider. And I love that you're considering, like, okay, what is it that I don't know? And let me ask a good question.
Yeah.
It's always good to ask a good question.
Yeah.
Give people that freedom
Yeah.
to come in, or they're not ready to come in.
Yeah. And if you've never done it, then I'd say start in the areas where it really there's no skin in the game. Like, how hard could it be to just get some basic facts of life? Like, where were you born? Tell me about your proposal. Like, how did you meet my dad? Tell me about your grandma, right? Like, what did you do for holidays? Like, there's so much you can even understand about a person in just sharing like basic facts. Like,
Absolutely.
they don't have to be anything, and then using that as your stepping ground to really dig in deeper. So, well, thank you so much, Mom. I really appreciate your time. Let us know, you guys, if you have any more questions. We're both here. We're both open books to hear whatever you want to hear. But I just wish you guys all the best to be able to really own your relationships and to dig deeper. Get curious. Until next time, bye.
Bye, everybody.